I once believed that family was the safest place for my child, until something that kept happening made me stop trusting that idea. My name is Bianca. I am 34 years old, a mother who has always believed that protecting my child is not just a feeling, but a job that never stops. I did not grow up thinking that danger would come from people in my own family, people who laughed at the same dinner table and said everything they did came from love. That belief started to break the first time I heard someone act like a hard slap to my son's head was just a joke meant to show love. They called it a love tap. They said it casually, confidently, as if giving it a nice name made it okay. One moment still plays in my head because it was said so easily, with a smile and without thinking twice. Relax. It's just a love tap. That sentence hit me harder than the sound itself because it told me how lightly everyone around us treated something that made my child freeze instead of laugh. I noticed the change long before I understood it. My son grew quieter in certain rooms. His shoulders would get tight when voices got loud behind him. His eyes would search my face, as if asking permission to stay silent. I felt worry settle into my chest, not as panic, but as a steady warning I could not ignore. Still, I had no proof, only instinct. And in a family where laughter was louder than worry, instinct was easy to dismiss. What stopped me from dismissing it was a small moment that looked ordinary to everyone else. To me, it felt like a line being crossed while no one was watching closely enough. That was when I knew this was not about humor, tradition, or being too sensitive. It was about boundaries being erased under the cover of family closeness. Before I go any further, if you believe family love should never come at the cost of a child's safety, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel and listen to how silence almost protected the wrong person. Before I had words for what felt wrong, I noticed the change in my son through small reactions that appeared whenever certain names came up in conversation. The shift was not big or sudden enough to alarm anyone else, but it stayed with me because it kept happening in quiet ways that were impossible to ignore once I started paying attention. Each time Karen was mentioned, his body would get tense, as if his body reacted faster than his thoughts. His eyes would look away from mine, as though he hoped the moment would pass without questions. The fear did not show itself through tears or obvious panic, which made it easier for others to miss. But it showed itself through reactions that felt practiced rather than accidental. His shoulders would lift slightly when footsteps sounded behind him. His hands would go still when voices grew louder, as though he were waiting for something that never needed to be explained out loud. I watched these reactions closely because they did not belong to a child who felt safe. Yet they appeared only in very specific moments tied to one person. Whenever I tried to gently ask about Karen, he found ways to change the conversation without sounding defensive. He would suddenly ask about dinner plans, homework, or anything that shifted attention away from the subject before I could finish my question. If I pressed just a little further, his answer stayed short but careful, shaped to end the discussion rather than continue it. He would say he was fine, that nothing was wrong, or that he was tired and wanted to go to his room. And each response felt rehearsed in a way that unsettled me. I made a conscious effort not to push him because I understood how easily fear could grow if a child felt cornered. Instead, I focused on creating moments where silence was allowed, hoping he would speak when he felt ready rather than when I demanded answers. I sat beside him during normal parts of our day, listening more than talking, watching for signs that might explain what he could not yet say. The patience felt necessary, even though it left me with unanswered questions that followed me long after the house went quiet. What worried me most was how intentional his avoidance seemed, especially when conversations drifted toward family gatherings or upcoming visits. He did not complain or ask to stay home, yet his body language shifted in ways that suggested worry rather than relief. His breathing changed. His attention narrowed. His voice grew careful, as though he were choosing each word, hoping that none of them would invite further discussion. These were not the reactions of a child reacting to a place or a situation, but to the thought of a specific person entering his space again. The moment that confirmed my concern came during an ordinary part of our routine that should have passed without notice. I reached out to touch his head in a familiar gesture, something I had done countless times without hesitation, and he flinched before realizing it was me. The reaction lasted only a second, but it carried more meaning than anything he had said before. He apologized immediately, his voice tense, as if he feared he had done something wrong by reacting at all. And that apology stayed with me long after he walked away. That brief moment told me his fear was not imagined or temporary, but learned through repetition, reinforced by experiences he did not yet know how to explain. It was then I understood that this was not a misunderstanding I could ignore, or a phase that would fade on its own. Something had already shaped his instincts, and those instincts were asking for protection before he ever found the words to ask himself. A few days later, I chose to speak with my sister Karen, not because I believed I already knew the answer, but because avoiding the question felt more dangerous than asking it. I reminded myself that suspicion alone was not enough to justify silence, especially when the situation involved my child. I approached the conversation carefully, determined to listen rather than accuse, knowing that once words were spoken with force, they could not be taken back. I started by explaining that Ethan had been more withdrawn lately, framing my concern around his emotions instead of any specific behavior. I told Karen that I was trying to understand what he might be reacting to, not looking for someone to blame. My tone stayed calm because I wanted the space between us to remain open rather than defensive. I asked if she had noticed anything unusual about him, or if there had been moments when he seemed uncomfortable that I might not have seen. Karen's response came quickly, though not sharply, and she dismissed the concern with a light shrug that felt practiced rather than thoughtful. She said, "Children go through phases, that worry had a way of creating problems when none existed, and that I had always been overly cautious." She suggested that my stress was likely affecting how I understood normal behavior, and that Ethan was probably reacting to changes in routine, rather than to anyone in particular. I listened without interrupting, even when her words brushed past the point I was trying to make. I clarified that my concern was not about routine or mood swings, but about how he reacted when certain topics came up. I asked whether she had ever noticed him pulling away during conversations or freezing in response to casual interactions. I was careful to keep my questions open-ended, leaving room for explanation rather than demanding agreement. Her expression shifted slightly at that point, subtle enough that someone less attentive might have missed it. She paused before answering, then said she had always been playful with him, that kids sometimes misunderstood affection, and that there was nothing unusual about their interactions. She laughed lightly as she spoke, treating the subject as something too small to deserve serious attention. The way she framed her answer felt less like reassurance and more like avoidance, though she never raised her voice or challenged my concern directly. I asked one final question, choosing my words slowly because I wanted clarity rather than conflict. I told her that Ethan seemed tense when her name came up, and I wanted to understand why that might be. Karen responded by saying children reflected adult anxiety, implying that my worry could be shaping his reactions more than anything she had done. She suggested I relax, trust family, and stop searching for meaning where none existed. I ended the conversation there, not because I felt reassured, but because continuing would have shifted the tone into something I was not ready for yet. There was no argument, no raised voices, and no clear admission that could explain Ethan's fear. Still, the conversation left me unsettled in a way I could not dismiss. Her answers were smooth, confident, and carefully vague, offering explanations without ever addressing the specific discomfort I had described. As I walked away, I realized that while I had not uncovered proof, I had uncovered something else that mattered just as much. My questions had been met with avoidance rather than curiosity, reassurance rather than reflection, and certainty rather than concern. I had started the conversation hoping to understand, and I ended it knowing that understanding would not come easily. But the doubt I felt now was clearer, heavier, and no longer something I could ignore. Not long after that, everything I had questioned quietly was pushed into the open, no longer contained by family conversations or private doubts. The moment came during a children's soccer game, one of those ordinary afternoons where parents stood along the sidelines watching without expecting anything more than a routine match. I had brought Ethan to play, hoping the fresh air and familiar faces would help him relax, though I noticed his tension return the second Karen appeared nearby. She moved easily through the crowd, smiling, speaking loudly, drawing attention in a way that made Ethan shift closer to me. I told myself not to overreact, reminding myself that suspicion without proof could distort perception. Yet my focus never left my son. When the game paused and the children gathered near the edge of the field, Karen stepped toward Ethan, reaching out as if to correct him or get his attention. What followed happened quickly, but not quietly. Her hand struck the side of his head with a sharp motion that was far too forceful to be mistaken for play. Ethan froze before he reacted. His body stiffened, as if his mind needed an extra moment to catch up with what his instincts already knew. His face drained of color. His eyes widened, and he pulled back without a sound. The fear was unmistakable to anyone watching closely enough. Karen laughed immediately, brushing it off with a familiar tone that made my chest tighten. "It's just a love tap," she said, loud enough for several people nearby to hear. The words landed in the open air, stripped of the privacy that had once protected them. Ethan did not laugh, did not protest, and did not move toward her, which made the moment stretch longer than it should have. A woman standing a few feet away reacted before I did. Her voice cut through the noise of the field. "That's not okay," she said firmly, stepping closer with a look of disbelief. The crowd shifted attention, pulling toward us as another parent raised a phone, clearly recording what had just happened. Karen's smile faltered for the first time, replaced by a quick glance around as she realized this was no longer a family matter she could dismiss. I moved instinctively, placing myself between Ethan and Karen. My hand stayed steady despite the rush of adrenaline. I did not shout or accuse, but my presence alone changed the tone of the moment. Ethan gripped my sleeve tightly. His breathing was uneven. His earlier silence was replaced by a quiet shake of his head that told me everything I needed to know. Karen tried to explain herself. Her voice was lighter than the situation demanded. She repeated that it was nothing serious, that people were overreacting, and that kids needed to toughen up. Her words sounded hollow against the reality unfolding around us. The recording phone remained raised, capturing not only the action, but the reactions that followed, including the way Ethan avoided her gaze entirely. The game had stopped by then, replaced by murmurs and uncomfortable stares. Someone suggested calling staff, while another parent asked if Ethan was all right. Karen stood still. Her confidence was slipping as she realized this moment could not be rewritten or reframed later. The evidence existed now, not as interpretation or memory, but as something concrete that could not be denied. As we walked away from the field, I understood that the line had been crossed in a way that could never be undone. What had once been dismissed as harmless inside the family had revealed itself publicly for what it truly was. From that point on, nothing about the situation belonged to silence, excuses, or private explanations anymore. After that incident, the video began moving in ways I could not control, passing from one phone to another until it reached people who had not even been present that day. Some family members watched it more than once, slowing it down, replaying the moment, then watching again as if repetition might soften what it showed. Others refused to watch at all, insisting that context mattered more than footage, even though the context was clearly visible to anyone willing to look closely. Conversations that once felt unified started to break into opposing sides, creating distance where there had always been routine agreement. A few relatives downplayed the incident, calling it an exaggeration captured from the wrong angle, while others admitted they felt uneasy seeing it happen in public. The same video produced entirely different reactions depending on who watched it, which only deepened the divide. I listened as people spoke around me, noticing how quickly concern turned into debate and how easily the focus shifted away from Ethan. Several voices suggested that making the situation bigger than necessary would only damage family relationships. I was told that children were resilient, that public embarrassment could follow Karen longer than the moment itself, and that addressing it quietly would be kinder for everyone involved. The word harmony came up more than once, framed as something fragile that needed protection. Each time I heard it, I felt the weight of what was being asked of me without being stated directly. The pressure to remain silent did not arrive as a command, but as a series of gentle suggestions layered with emotional responsibility. I was reminded of shared history, upcoming gatherings, and how uncomfortable things could become if this issue continued to surface. Some implied that my role was to calm the situation, to help everyone move forward by letting it fade. None of them asked how Ethan was coping, or what the moment had done to his sense of safety. I noticed how the conversation rarely centered on his reaction, even though it was clearly visible in the footage. Instead, the focus stayed on interpretation, intent, and reputation, as though those factors mattered more than how a child responded when trust was broken in public. The longer these discussions continued, the clearer it became that this could not be resolved through internal reassurance or careful wording alone. What had happened was no longer confined to a misunderstanding between relatives. I reached a point where the choice in front of me felt painfully simple, even though the consequences were not. I could preserve a version of peace that required silence, or I could protect my son in a way that might permanently change how the family functioned. The decision did not come from anger or spite, but from clarity. Ethan's safety was not a topic open for compromise, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth made others feel. Once I made that decision, the tone of conversation shifted again, this time toward urgency. Some relatives urged me to reconsider, warning that outside involvement would escalate matters beyond repair. Others stayed quiet. Their silence spoke louder than words. The family dynamic I had known began to dissolve, replaced by uncertainty and guarded exchanges that made it clear this issue could not be smoothed over with apologies or private conversations. By then, it was obvious that what had started as a single moment on a soccer field had evolved into something far larger. The video existed. The reactions were divided. The expectations placed on me were incompatible with the reality I faced as a parent. This situation had outgrown the boundaries of family discussion, and no amount of careful language could return it to something manageable through internal agreement alone. When that line was crossed, I understood that waiting would only make things worse, not safer. I contacted my lawyer, Daniel, because I needed guidance grounded in law rather than emotion, and I needed to know exactly what steps protected my son without making the situation unnecessarily worse. From the beginning, Daniel made it clear that this was not about revenge or punishment, but about documenting facts, establishing boundaries, and ensuring accountability through the proper channels. We reviewed everything carefully, including the video, witness statements, and the pattern of behavior that led up to that moment. Daniel explained the process in plain terms, outlining what actions were appropriate and what could hurt credibility if handled impulsively. Each step was measured, deliberate, and designed to prevent further harm rather than provoke confrontation. I followed that structure closely, knowing that acting within the law was the only way to move forward without creating new risks for my family. As those steps began, Karen started facing consequences that could not be dismissed as misunderstandings or overreactions. She was contacted formally, informed of the concerns raised, and made aware that her actions were now part of an official record. The shift was immediate. What she had once brushed off as harmless behavior was no longer framed as a personal disagreement, but as conduct subject to scrutiny. That change altered how she responded, replacing casual confidence with visible restraint. The reaction from the rest of the family followed quickly. Calls and messages came in, urging me to slow down, to reconsider, to think about how far this could go if it continued. Some framed their concern as worry for Karen, others as fear of long-term consequences that could affect everyone. A few suggested mediation or private agreements, hoping the issue could still be contained within family boundaries. Each attempt carried the same underlying request, which was for me to stop before the process reached its conclusion. I listened to those voices without engaging in debate because the decision had already been made based on facts rather than feelings. I explained calmly that the steps taken were not negotiable and that protecting my son required consistency rather than compromise. This was not a matter that could be settled by reassurance or promises, especially when evidence already existed. My role was no longer to balance comfort for others, but to ensure safety through accountability. The pressure intensified when it became clear that the process would continue regardless of emotional appeals. Some family members expressed disappointment. Others withdrew altogether, creating distance that felt deliberate. I accepted that reaction as part of the cost of choosing clarity over convenience. The dynamic shifted from discussion to acceptance, even if that acceptance came quietly and without approval. Throughout it all, I stayed focused on the purpose of these actions. Every document filed, every conversation recorded, and every boundary enforced served a single goal. I wanted to make sure that what happened would not happen again to my child or to anyone else. This was not about changing opinions, but about changing outcomes through lawful means. As the process moved forward, I noticed a difference in how I carried myself. The uncertainty that once followed every decision had been replaced by steadiness. I knew that even if relationships were strained, I had chosen the only path that aligned with my responsibility as a parent. The intervention was no longer just a response to one incident, but a statement that certain lines, once crossed, demanded action rather than silence. A few months later, everything reached an ending that could not be reversed. What had begun as concern inside a family became a legal matter resolved through formal channels, step by step, under the framework of the American legal system. There were hearings, reviews of evidence, statements examined carefully, and decisions made without emotion or family context influencing the outcome. The process moved slowly but decisively, guided by procedure rather than opinion, which was exactly what I had hoped for from the beginning. The legal decision was delivered clearly and without confusion. Karen was found responsible for her actions and faced consequences that were concrete rather than symbolic. Restrictions were placed that limited her access to my son, alongside mandatory requirements designed to prevent further harm. These were not temporary warnings or verbal cautions. They were enforceable conditions, documented and binding, leaving no room for reinterpretation or dismissal as a misunderstanding. The system treated the situation for what it was, not what anyone wished it had been. When the outcome became known, the family had no option but to accept it. Some reacted with silence, others with visible discomfort. Yet no one could argue with the legitimacy of the process. The decision had been reached by professionals who had no stake in family dynamics or emotional history. That reality forced a shift. Conversations stopped circling around intentions and began to acknowledge consequences. Even those who disagreed understood that the matter was closed from a legal standpoint. For me, the decision clarified what I already knew needed to happen. I cut off all contact with Karen completely, not as an act of punishment, but as a protective boundary that could not be negotiated. There were no calls, no messages, no indirect attempts at communication allowed through other relatives. Every channel was closed deliberately because partial distance would only create confusion. My priority was not reconciliation, but stability for my son, who deserved a life free from fear disguised as familiarity. There were attempts by family members to suggest time would soften things, or that distance might eventually allow a careful reconnection. I listened without engaging in debate because the answer remained unchanged. What had been broken could not be repaired through patience alone. Trust does not return simply because time passes, especially when the cost of being wrong would fall on a child rather than an adult. I chose certainty over hope, even when that choice made others uncomfortable. Life after the ruling felt quieter in a way that surprised me. The constant tension I had been carrying eased once there was nothing left to decide. My son began to relax in ways that did not require explanation, responding to consistency rather than reassurance. The absence of forced interaction allowed healing to begin without pressure. That change confirmed that the decision had not only been legally correct, but personally necessary. There was no final confrontation, no emotional closure scene, and no apology that rewrote the past. The ending came through paperwork, firm boundaries, and silence where noise once existed. The story did not resolve with forgiveness or renewed connection. It resolved with separation and accountability. That was the only ending that truly protected what mattered most. When enough time had passed, I looked back at everything with a clarity I had never known before. Life for my son and me became quieter in ways that mattered, shaped by routines that no longer carried tension beneath them. Our days followed a steady rhythm built on predictability rather than watchfulness, which allowed both of us to breathe without bracing for what might happen next. The absence of certain people created space for calm, and that calm became the foundation for healing rather than a temporary pause. Ethan changed in subtle ways that felt significant. He slept through the night without waking in confusion. He spoke more freely about small things and moved through his day without scanning his surroundings for reassurance. The guarded expressions that once appeared without warning softened over time, replaced by a steadiness that reflected trust in the world around him. Nothing dramatic announced this shift, yet the consistency of it confirmed that safety does not need to be explained to a child. It simply needs to exist. I accepted that protecting my son required letting go of relationships I once believed were permanent. That loss carried weight, especially when it came from family ties that had shaped my identity for years. Still, I learned that distance can be an act of care rather than rejection, chosen not to punish others, but to preserve what is vulnerable. Walking away did not erase the past. yet it allowed the future to form without repeating old harm under new names. There were moments when the cost of my decision felt heavy, particularly during quiet evenings when memories surfaced without warning. Even then, I reminded myself that peace built on silence about wrongdoing is never true peace. Choosing clarity meant accepting loneliness at times, although that loneliness was honest and did not ask my child to carry an adult burden. The stability we gained outweighed what we lost, because safety must always come before belonging. As time continued forward, I recognized that boundaries are not signs of coldness, but evidence of responsibility. They define where care ends and control begins, especially within families where harmful behavior can hide behind familiarity. I no longer questioned whether I had acted too firmly. The calm in my son's presence answered that question more clearly than words ever could. No harmful behavior deserves protection under the name of family. When adults stay silent to preserve comfort, that silence can become a lasting wound for a child who depends on them for safety. Accountability is not betrayal, and setting boundaries does not destroy families. It reveals which relationships are willing to respect the well-being of the most vulnerable. Protecting a child always matters, more than preserving appearances. Thank you for staying with the story until the end and for giving it your time and attention. I truly appreciate your willingness to listen to a difficult experience with openness. If you feel comfortable, I invite you to share your thoughts about family boundaries, responsibility, or protecting children in the comments. Your perspective may help others feel less alone.